Obligation number 6, the historic obligation. As I said earlier, if you're doing a contemporary play or movie that is present, in the present, you don't have a historical obligation. But if you're doing a film or a play from the 60s, there is a historical obligation. Things were different in the 60s than they are in the 2000s, in the 21st century. So you would have to accommodate the historical responsibilities, the customs, the morality, the emphasis of life, the political realities, anything that the dress, what people conform to, what their most important thrusts and goals were in their life at that time. Now, a historical obligation could be 12th century England. A historical obligation could be December 7th, 1941, and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and all of what followed in 1941, 42, 43, 44, the war years. An actor has got to do research and work for choices that will put him or her back in that period of time. Reading, researching, evaluating, getting into the psychology and the emphasis of what people thought about in those days. And so I directed a play called Glass Menagerie, which takes place in the 30s. And we worked on it for 8, 9, 10 months. And we listened to all of the records and the speeches of President Roosevelt at the time. We read all the Time Life books of the historic element of that time. We got deeply seated in that time, and we worked for the fears, the economy of the time, the depression, the feelings of hopelessness of that time, and what was going on in the world at the time, and we steeped ourselves in parallel choices which made us experience and feel what the characters felt like at that time. So the historical obligation, unlike time and place, it is time and place of a different time than the present. And if you're doing a contemporary piece of material, there is no historic obligation. But even 10 years ago, the 90s, the 80s, you have to address that with an eye to what was going on then as opposed to what's going on now. Number 7, the subtextual obligation. Now this one is a little bit difficult to fathom in the beginning, but it doesn't exist in every single piece of material. It's as much a director's obligation as it is the actor's obligation. The subtextual obligation is the underlife, the essence, the ambiance of the piece. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Maxwell Anderson's play, Winterset, takes place 30s, when there was a lot of immigrant resistance. People were, the economy was really not good, and people resented immigrants coming to this country and taking jobs. There was a sense of hopelessness about it. We were in a deep depression, and it had an ambiance of an underlife of fear and hopelessness and depression and angst and anger. And somehow the director has to accommodate that, and each actor dealing with a piece of material that has that kind of underlife or ambiance must pay attention to the choices that you select to address the obligations of the material. They have to be selected within mind of that particular subtextual obligation. Now, in Winterset, Maxwell Anderson's Winterset, the only light at the end of the tunnel was Mio and Miriamne. There were 2 young lovers. Now, Mio's father was executed for He was an immigrant, and he was executed for conspiracy to commit something. And he was railroaded, and they executed him. It was based on the Sacco Vanzetti reality of that period. And there was a lot of angst and fear and depression and anger and a sense of hopelessness. Mio and Mariamne brought to it the only light at the end of the tunnel. Every actor in the piece has to accommodate the fact that the underlife and the ambiance of the play had all of those elements. And with that in mind, the actor has to make choices that accommodate that. All of the actors in the piece. So to wrap up all 7 obligations, which I have, I'm going to do it again. Okay. So I've discussed all 7 obligations in detail. And as I said earlier, not every single obligation exists in every piece of material. It's the actor's responsibility in reading the material to find out what his or her responsibilities are. There's always a time and place obligation. There's always a emotional obligation. There's always a relationship obligation. And if you fit the character to a T, you don't have to work for that. So identifying all 7 obligations is paramount to addressing a piece of material. And if you are a craftsperson and you have a craft so that you can select the choices and using the choice approaches to fulfill those obligations, then it's a no-brainer.